Hello and welcome to my review of Flashman by George Macdonald Fraser. Flashman was first published in 1969 and launched a lengthy series of novels that followed the life of Harry Flashman from his expulsion from rugby school and through a military career that would take him to most of the world and through the lives of all sorts of famous historical figures. Flashman first appeared more than 100 years earlier in the novel Tom Brown's School Days by Victorian author Thomas Hughes. While the empire was in its death throes in Fraser's time, it was very much in its pomp during Hughes's. As such, Fraser can turn a more critical eye to the British and their institutions. As usual, there is a plot summary, and as usual, you can skip it if you wish, and as usual, none of the rest of the review should be considered spoiler-free either. Flashman, on his expulsion from school, detailed by Hughes as much as by Fraser, joins the army. Specifically, he joins the Dragoons, despairing of their idiot commander, even though, being white and gentlemanly, he is one of his favourites. Flashman finds the uniform helps him attract women, and he has little interest in any other aspect of military life. One such woman leads him to a duel with a peer, surviving and enhancing his reputation by cheating, but he is sent to a different company in Scotland, and a dalliance with a Scottish woman leads him to marry Elspeth. The lowly status of his new wife leads him to be transferred away from the Dragoons and the snobbish Lord Cardigan, and then Flashman is posted to India. There he's reassigned to General Elphinstone, the latest in a long list of useless or idiotic commanders, and eventually Flashman ends up in Afghanistan. There he rapes a local woman, making a serious enemy of a local. Then, while surveying the country and realising that the British position there is highly precarious, he's sent on a diplomatic mission. His column is attacked and the local enemy tries to murder him, but he finds himself in the company of the King in exile, who sends him back to the British with an offer of peace that is sleazy at worst, dangerous at best. And so it proves when the British general heads out to meet the wannabe king without an escort and is murdered. Flashman flees, not for the first or last time. Then British interests under Elphinstone collapse, leading to a hasty retreat from Kabul that ends in slaughter. Flashman finds himself in a small fort. Preferring to cry and whine instead of helping the besieged defenders, he becomes the sole survivor and therefore a national hero. He returns home to an audience with the Queen and an ageing Lord Wellington. However, he discovers his circumstances have changed. His drunkard father has bankrupted the family, and he is now dependent on his wife for money, and she has taken up with a local soldier in his absence. Flashman isn't completely happy with his new circumstances, but is such a spineless, wimpy waste of space, he finds he can make the best of them. The plot, then, is not much more than a retelling of, embellishing here and there, the history of the British in Afghanistan, largely accepted as a campaign of arrogant assumptions of our own superiority in the face of a less regimented but far more organised and committed militia. At least we weren't the last to fall into that particular trap. But there is a way to do this sort of thing well, and there are a few finer examples than Blackadder. But for the most part, the cynical Blackadder was the protagonist and relatable with it, the grounding, if you like, amongst the more madcap. I must say, you're not going to get that with Flashman, as we will see, but even British science fiction like Red Dwarf have time-travelled or found other ways to bring characters like Elvis, JFK and even Jesus into the show with comedic effect. What humour is there in Fraser's retelling of the British meddling in Afghanistan, being motivated by keeping pro-Russian sentiment out of the country, only to cause it with their heavy-handed tactics? It reads more like an encyclopedia than a comedy. Likewise, the ridiculous incompetence of Elphinstone, who manages to get virtually all of his people killed with his dithering, doesn't come with a lot of laughs. Both descriptions might be accurate enough, but there's little comedy to be found in either. That's not to say that Flashman, the book, is completely devoid of humour. After Elphinstone manages to shoot himself in the buttock, one soldier's observation that it was doubtless in an attempt to blow his brains out is the sort of thing the book could have done with a lot more of. I'm sure that a barracks full of real soldiers would be considerably funnier than this book portrays them. That is in part because the book thinks that Flashman himself is funny, and so the people around him don't need to be, which I'm sure you'll notice is the opposite of something like Blackadder, who is cynical and sarcastic, but much more grounded than the people around him. Likewise, there isn't anybody in the world who pokes fun of the British better than the British. That's poking fun of ourselves or each other as neighbours, and Fraser does this occasionally no better than Flashman generates a rare laugh when he describes the Indians like this. I like them better than the Scots anyhow, their language was easier to understand. Or when the garrison in Kabul demonstrates cricket to a local dignitary who comments, strange and manifold are the ways of God. This was the sort of humour I expected when I picked up this book, because the back cover promises it's about a character who romps his way through the boudoirs of Victorian Britain to the erotic frontiers of her empire. Is it wrong then to expect a good romp in both sense of the words? If you do, you'll be disappointed. The first sign of that comes pretty early in proceedings. Flashman returns to his father's house to find he has a new live-in lover. He observes, "You got used to a string of madams. They changed as fast as the sentry at St. James's." Now, the nitpicker in me can't let a line like that go, because the guard at St. James's doesn't change fast. That's not the point of it. It changes often, which additional accuracy doesn't harm the gag at all. What does harm the gag is Flashman's violent and sexual assault of his father's madam, followed by a proud proclamation that she would not forget Harry Flashman in a hurry. He will later go on to actually rape an Afghan woman, the girlfriend and later wife of one of the local chieftains. After a vicious struggle, I managed to rape her. The only time in my life I have found it necessary, by the way. It has its points, but I shouldn't care to do it regularly. I prefer willing women. The first sentence seems to end with an element of apologia, but the second is frankly horrific, and the last is an outright lie given his treatment of a variety of whores, especially Fetnab, his concubine in India. When discussing the reasons for his expulsion from rugby school with an officer who had also been a student there in the past, the officer, learning Flashman was expelled for drunkenness, observes, "Who'd have believed they would kick you out for that? They'll be expelling for rape next." One wonders who is raping who in an all-boys boarding school, but either way, the whole thing is pretty foul, but sadly not out of keeping with the book. Flashman is utterly unlikable, but not the sort of cad whose behaviour becomes shocking or amusing. He's just foul. When not abusing women, he's abusing everybody else, especially the locals in India and Afghanistan, and the language used, while probably in keeping with the time and the character, will simply be a red flag for a lot of people. 60 years is a long time, and this was written in the 1960s, but set even further back in the 1840s. Even allowing for that, I'm pretty sure this is not going to be reprinted anytime soon, so hang on to your copies if you have one. And of course, to be fair to Fraser, Flashman is supposed to be unlikable, so he has done his job very well, not just via archaic attitudes and taboo words. Early on, when Flashman describes his grandfather as having made his family fortune in slaves, rum and piracy too, it is clearly to demonstrate that immorality runs deep. His behaviour too in some of the book's key moments is well executed when he's captured by the Afghans and attempts to sell out his companion Hudson to be tortured instead of him. It has some of that same vibe that Orwell has in Room 101. It is undeniably well done, though obviously few people are in Orwell's league. The death of Hudson is well written and powerful stuff, contrasted again with Flashman's continuing disgrace. Hudson's heroics are well executed. They give tension to the siege of the British garrison, because without him there really is nobody to root for. Flashman is an ass, and he deliberately marginalises and dismisses the native soldiers. By far the siege of Piper'S fort is the best part of the book. It is one of the few times Fraser really describes the battle as if you were right there, and he does it well. When Flashman is rescued, he realises that Hudson, should he have survived, could well incriminate him, so he inquires after the sergeant, and the doctor mistakes this as done out of concern, and from there the rumour of the gallant hero spreads through the army in no time. Flashman the coward is hailed the hero. All of this section is good without delivering what the book was supposed to promise, some laughs. It's a strength and a weakness, I guess, that the book is at its best when the comedy is sidelined. As commentary on the army of the time, it still isn't any better than okay, because as Flashman observes, the British Empire covered a significant part of the globe at the time. How on earth did they manage that if they're all this useless? Another reason perhaps for Flashman to have been toned down enough, or given a companion at least, to represent the everyman. As commentary on humanity, it is, like in most other instances, inconsistent, as in these two examples. I saw young Lieutenant Sturt shot out of his saddle. He rolled into a drift and lay there screaming, but it would have done no good to stop. no good to Flashy anyway, and that was what mattered. There is great pleasure in catastrophe that doesn't touch you, and anyone that says there isn't is a liar. The former is boorish and dull because it's everywhere in this book. This must be the 10th time at least that Flashman has done and said this exact same thing. Even referring to himself as flashy makes him less likeable, which, as mentioned, is deliberate. But the latter example has the same cynicism, but expands the perspective to wider, or at least a less specific view of humanity. As commentary, it is far more interesting. In conclusion, if you're offended by racist language or behaviour, then there simply isn't the book for you. I find it hard to believe that even in the 1960s, rape was the subject of much comedy, but time has not been kind to this book, which doesn't handle the subject of racism in the same way as something like Till Death Us Do Part, or Love Thy Neighbour, which are both from the same era, and despite their attempts to show at least a degree of back and forth, are both controversial enough to some. Just don't pick up this book if you can't look beyond that sort of thing, and personally, I wouldn't hold it against anybody that felt like that. I found it uncomfortable and unpleasant reading at times, more often certainly than I found it funny. Flashman is utterly unlikable. He may have been a rogue, scoundrel, or even a cad in 1969, but I'm really not so sure, and in today's money, he's just a fucking wanker, pure and simple. His unpleasantness is clearly deliberate, but if you can't root for the rapist, the question then becomes, who do you root for? Perhaps nobody, and perhaps that is the point. But while we have an Afghaner to scorn, we don't have anybody to like until Hudson's arrival. He almost saves the book in the second half when the bitter flight from Afghanistan begins. Recounting one of the most disastrous chapters in British military history, Fraser dispenses with the comedy, and Flashman's capture and torture is well executed, as is Hudson's heroics and Flashman's cowardice at Piper Fort. For a writer to manage to create a story that has moments of genuine emotion and comedy is an undeniable achievement in itself. To pin that on a heart as rotten as Flashman is a tragedy. Despite undeniable strengths, this book is extremely hard to recommend. Thank you for watching. Liking and subscribing is the way to get more of this sort of thing.